The dark waters of Tripoli harbor that night seemed thick as oil and cold as the very breath of eternity. The calendar read February 16th, 1804. But time here, beneath the walls of the ancient fortress, seemed to stand still. The only sound disturbing the oppressive silence was the faint creak of rigging and the rustle of waves against the wooden sides of a small ketch gliding through the darkness. The vessel bore the name Intrepid, meaning fearless, and never had a ship's name so accurately matched the essence of the mission it was undertaking. On its deck, hidden in the shadow of the bulwarks, lay 70 volunteers. Their breathing was steady, but their hearts beat in the rhythm of inevitability. They were going straight into the lion's mouth, under the muzzles of 115 heavy guns of coastal batteries guarding the entrance to the bay. The target of this phantom raid was the frigate Philadelphia, once the pride of the American fleet, and now a trophy, anchored under an enemy flag as a silent reproach to the impotence of the young transatlantic republic. The operations commander, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, peered at the silhouette of the frigate, which grew larger with each passing minute, eclipsing the stars. There was no room for fear in his mind, only the cold calculation of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. This was not just a military assignment, it was a matter of national honor. If they failed, captivity or the end of their lives awaited them, and the United States would finally solidify its status as a second-rate power, one that could be disregarded. When a guttural shout from a sentry on board the _quote _3_ demanded to know their identity, the air thickened to the limit. The Sicilian pilot, standing next to Decatur, replied in impeccable Arabic that they were simple merchants from Malta, who had lost their anchors in a storm and begged for the opportunity to weather the night alongside a large ship. This lie was a thin thread on which the lives of all present hung. Permission was granted. The quote 4 pulled alongside. The moment the sides touched with a dull thud, the spring of tension uncoiled. The cry quote 5 tore through the night silence, and the shadows transformed into a furious element. The Americans surged onto the frigate's deck in a single wave. The order was strict: no shooting, use only cold steel. In the cramped space of the deck, a silent, brutal struggle erupted, where the clang of steel against steel was louder than any screams. The enemy crew, caught by surprise, could not organize resistance. 20 minutes later, it was all over. The frigate was under control, but it was impossible to sail her away. The second phase began: destruction. Decatur's men worked quickly and methodically, placing flammable materials at key points of the vessel. As they left the ship, tongues of flame were already licking at the masts. Soon, the Philadelphia turned into a giant torch, illuminating the harbor with an infernal light. The coastal batteries opened fire, but it was too late. The Americans were leaving behind a blazing symbol of their rebirth. To understand how a nation, which just yesterday was fighting for its survival, came to such audacity, we need to rewind the tape of history and look at the geopolitical map at the turn of the century. At the end of the 18th century, the Mediterranean was not just a trade crossroads, but a zone of legalized predation. The states of the Barbary Coast, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, built a unique economic model based on maritime brigandage. This was racketeering on a state scale. European empires, busy with their endless wars, preferred to buy off the pirates, paying annual tribute. For them, it was just an expense item, a cynical accounting calculation. But for the United States, which had just gained independence, this situation became a cold shower of reality. After 1783, American merchant ships lost the protection of the British fleet. The stars and stripes on the mast no longer deterred corsairs, but rather attracted them like a magnet. American ships were captured by the dozens, cargoes were confiscated, and sailors were enslaved, becoming living commodities in the markets of North Africa. This was a deep shock to the national consciousness. A country that proclaimed the ideals of freedom and human rights found itself unable to protect its own citizens from shackles. Confusion reigned in Washington, the treasury was empty, and the Navy practically did not exist. The last ships of the Continental Navy had been sold for debts. Political elites were split. Some called for paying tribute, following Europe's example, while others demanded a forceful response. Thomas Jefferson, who took office as president in 1801, faced a difficult dilemma. Ideologically, he was an opponent of a large standing army and navy, seeing them as instruments of tyranny and a threat to Republican liberties. He dreamed of a rural republic, living in peace and trading with everyone. But reality was harsh. Pasha Yusuf Karamanli of Tripoli, sensing American weakness, constantly raised the stakes. His demands grew exponentially. At some point, it became clear that the appetites of the Barbary rulers were bottomless. The popular slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," born during the crisis with France, became for the new administration not just beautiful words, but a guide to action. Jefferson turned this emotional impulse into a cold, strategic vector. The president made an unprecedented decision to send a squadron to the Mediterranean without a formal declaration of war by Congress, thereby creating a historical precedent for the use of presidential powers in foreign policy. The beginning of the war, however, did not bring swift victories. The first years of the campaign resembled more a series of unsuccessful experiments. American squadrons under Commodores Dale and Morris acted indecisively, constrained by instructions and lack of experience. They tried to blockade ports, but their ships were too heavy for coastal waters, and the corsairs too elusive. European powers viewed these attempts with ironic smiles, and the rulers of the Barbary coast only grew stronger in their belief that Americans were weak adversaries. The morale of the crews plummeted, discipline loosened. It seemed the skeptics were right. The idea of projecting power thousands of miles from home shores was a utopia. The situation changed dramatically only in 1803 with the appointment of Edward Preble as squadron commander. This man from Maine was a living embodiment of severity and professionalism. Suffering chronic illnesses that made his character unbearable, he nonetheless possessed a clear strategic mind and an iron will. Arriving on his flagship, the Constitution, Preble was horrified by the state of affairs. He saw before him an officer corps consisting of very young men, almost boys. But instead of complaining about poor material, he began to forge warriors out of them. Preble introduced rigorous discipline and a system of constant training. He taught them not just to manage sails, but to think tactically, make split-second decisions, and take responsibility. A group of young officers, among whom were Stephen Decatur, William Bainbridge, Isaac Hull, and Charles Stewart, earned the nickname Preble's Boys. It was they who were destined to become the golden fund of the American fleet. However, before glory came, a misfortune occurred that brought the entire campaign to the brink of disaster. On October 31, 1803, the frigate Philadelphia, under the command of William Bainbridge, was pursuing an enemy vessel at the entrance to Tripoli harbor. Carried away by the chase and unaware of the exact depth charts, Bainbridge made a fatal error. The heavy frigate, at full speed, crashed into an underwater reef. The impact was so strong that it knocked people off their feet. The ship got stuck, helplessly leaning forward. It was every captain's nightmare. The crew tried to save the ship. Cannons, cannonballs, water supplies were thrown overboard. Even the foremast was chopped down. But all in vain. Enemy gunboats surrounded the immobilized giant and began a methodical bombardment. Realizing the futility of resistance, Bainbridge was forced to strike the flag. 307 sailors and officers were taken prisoner. The capture of the Philadelphia was not just a military loss, but a severe psychological blow. Pasha Tripoli gained a powerful trump card. Hundreds of hostages and a serviceable, though damaged, modern warship. It seemed the war was lost. But it was at this moment that the character forged by Preble manifested itself. Instead of despairing, the Americans responded with fury. Decatur's destruction of the **1 described at the beginning was a direct answer to this challenge. It was a signal. We don't give up, we get angrier. After this event, the war entered a new, more brutal phase. Preble organized a tight blockade and began a series of massive bombardments of Tripoli. Heavy frigates approached the shore and engaged in artillery duels with the fortress. American gunboats clashed with corsairs in close combat. The water in the harbor boiled from cannonball explosions. These battles became a crucible in which characters were forged. There was no room for abstract theories here, only the practice of survival and victory. In one such clash, an episode occurred that became legendary. Stephen Decatur's brother James was treacherously shot by an enemy captain who had supposedly already surrendered. Upon learning of this, Stephen, consumed by cold rage, gave chase. He overtook the killer's boat, boarded it, and in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, teetering on the brink of death, avenged his brother. This moment showed the enemy that the Americans had come not just to perform their duty, they had come to fight, personally, passionately, and to the end. Pasha Yusuf, observing this from the walls of his palace, began to realize that the opponent before him was not the same as before. But war is not just cannons and sails. There was another, hidden layer of conflict unfolding in the scorching sands of the desert. William Eaton, a former army officer and diplomat, proposed a plan that many in Washington considered madness. He believed that naval power was not enough. To defeat a tyrant, one must strip him of legitimacy. Eaton found the Pasha's exiled elder brother, Hamet Karamanli, in Egypt, and persuaded him to lead a march on Tripoli to reclaim the throne. This was an outright gamble. Eaton, possessing the charisma of a prophet and the stubbornness of a mule, assembled an astonishing army. 8 American Marines under the command of Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, several dozen Christian mercenaries, a detachment of Arab cavalry, and hundreds of camels. This motley crowd was to travel over 500 miles across the Libyan desert. Eaton's march became an epic of overcoming. 50 days of hell. Heat that cracked the skin, lack of water, constant conflicts between Christians and Muslims in the detachment. Hamet, a weak and indecisive man, constantly tried to turn back. Eaton had to use all levers of influence, from bribery to direct threats with weapons, to force the army forward. O'Bannon's Marines, in this situation, became the steel core that kept the structure from falling apart. Their discipline and silent determination inspired respect even in the wild nomads. This campaign symbolized a new spirit of America, expansive, ready to overcome any boundaries for the sake of achieving a goal. In the spring of 1805, exhausted, looking like desert ghosts, Eaton's men reached the city of Derna, the second most important center of Tripolitania. The city's governor, confident in the impregnability of his walls, responded to the surrender offer laconically. _, 0 _. On April 27th, the assault began. This was the first ever joint operation of American land forces and the Navy. The ships, _1, _2, and _3 approached the shore and opened hurricane fire on the fortifications, covering the infantry attack. Eaton, despite a bullet wound to the wrist, continued to command. Marines and mercenaries stormed the fortress walls in a bayonet charge. The fury of their onslaught was such that the defenders faltered. By evening, the Stars and Stripes flag flew over the citadel of Derna, for the first time in the Eastern Hemisphere. The fall of Derna caused shock in Tripoli. Yusuf Karamanli realized that his power was hanging by a thread. A little more and Eaton's army, reinforced by rebellious tribes, would knock on the gates of the capital. And here, history made its usual cynical turn. While Eaton was preparing for the final push, diplomats concluded peace. Tobias Lear, the U.S. envoy, signed a treaty with Yusuf. Hostilities ceased. The U.S. paid $60,000 ransom for the prisoners from Philadelphia, but abolished the annual tribute. For Eaton, this was a betrayal. He felt that victory had been stolen from under his nose, and his ally Hammett had been cynically abandoned. The Americans had to secretly evacuate from Derna, leaving their Arab comrades to their fate. This was a bitter but important lesson in realpolitik. Military successes often become mere bargaining chips at the negotiating table. Nevertheless, the strategic significance of the war was colossal. The young republic underwent an initiation by blood. It proved to the world, and more importantly to itself, that it was capable of defending its interests anywhere on the globe. $60,000 in ransom was a negligible sum compared to the status it gained. The main outcome was the birth of a professional navy. Officers who went through Preble's School gained invaluable experience in combat management, logistics, and coordination from this war. 7 years later, when the war with Great Britain began, these very men, Hull, Decatur, Bainbridge, would stand at the helms of American frigates and inflict a series of painful defeats on the Royal Navy. They no longer feared the British because they knew the worth of themselves and their ships. The technical and tactical superiority of American frigates, such as the Constitution, was confirmed in practice. These ships, combining the power of a ship of the line with the speed of a frigate, proved to be an ideal tool for projecting force. But even more important was the moral aspect. The war gave the nation heroes. The Mamluk-style saber, presented by Hamet to Lieutenant O'Bannon after the assault on Derna, became the prototype for the weapon carried by U.S. Marine officers to this day. The line, "2" entered the Marines' hymn, immortalizing the memory of that incredible march across the sands. These symbols became part of the national code, uniting people from different states into a single nation. From a philosophical perspective, the First Barbary War became the moment when America first encountered the paradox of global power. Jefferson, who dreamed of isolation, was forced to become an interventionist. It became clear that in a close-knit world, it was impossible to remain aloof from international problems. Freedom of trade requires protection, and protection requires force. This conflict laid the foundation for American foreign policy for centuries to come. A willingness to use force to protect principles and interests, even on the other side of the world. Concluding our narrative, our mind's eye returns to that night when the _3_ burned. The fire consuming the ship was cleansing. In it, burned away the old complexes of colonial dependence and fear of the world's powerful. Against the backdrop of this flame, the outline of a future superpower emerged. History knows no subjunctive mood, but it can be said with certainty, without the experience of Tripoli, without the audacity of Decatur and the stubbornness of Eton, America's path to the status of a global naval power would have been much longer and more arduous. The events of those years are not just archival records. They are a living example of how the will and determination of a handful of people can change the course of history, turning the impossible into the inevitable. And today, looking at modern aircraft carriers crisscrossing the oceans, we see in their steel hulls a reflection of that distant fire in the harbor of Tripoli.